Hello, and welcome back to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I am your host. And today's chapter is Genesis 18. Let's go ahead and read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 18 has 33 verses. Let's go ahead and read them. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, and you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, She is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, No, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, Suppose 40 are found there. And he answered, For the sake of 40, I will not do it. And then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. And he answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. That is the text of Genesis chapter 18. Thank you, everybody, for joining again for another Bible study. We're picking up on the story of Abraham once again. We've been talking about him, talking specifically about a promise that was made to him, that God was going to give him a lot of children, that they were going to grow into a great nation. But there's been kind of this dilemma up to this point, and that is that Abraham hasn't had any children, or hasn't had any children with Sarah specifically, his wife. So back in chapter 12, God promises to make Abraham a great nation. He says, I'm going to give you a huge family. It's going to be uncountable like the stars of the sky, like the dust of the ground. A couple years go by, and Abraham and Sarah still don't have any children. And the reason is because Sarah is barren. She can't have any children. So Abraham's wondering about, well, how's this supposed to work? How am I going to have a big family? I can't even have one child. He asks God this question. He says, is my family line going to pass down figuratively through somebody else? And God says, no, it's going to pass down through your biological child. So we find that out in chapter 15. In chapter 16, Abraham has a biological son, but it's not with his wife Sarah. It's actually with another woman, one of Sarah's servants, Hagar. This son is going to eventually be named Ishmael. And Abraham perhaps thinks for a period of time that God's promises are going to come through Ishmael. But God comes to him in chapter 17 and says, no, it's not going to be through Ishmael. I'm actually going to give you a child with Sarah. His name is going to be Isaac, and it's through Isaac that you are going to receive these promises. It's through Isaac's line that these promises will be established. As we pick up in chapter 18, Isaac is not yet here. We're going to see this promise reaffirmed to Abraham and to Sarah, and we're going to see how Sarah responds. We're also going to move on to kind of another storyline, kind of a side storyline here, and that's the fate of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah, let's remind ourselves of what we know about them. We don't know too much. One thing we know about Sodom is that it's described in chapter 13, and do you remember how it's described? It's not a good way. That these people were super wicked, that they were great sinners before the Lord. So this is a really evil city. And that description back in 13 is several decades before the events that we're going to be reading about in this chapter. So they've had some time potentially to get even more wicked. We also know about Sodom that Lot, Abram's nephew, moved around the area of the city of Sodom. And so Abraham would certainly be interested in hearing whatever God had planned for that city. So we're going to talk about that. Let's go to our PDF now that we always use to outline these podcasts. If you would like it, it's totally free on our website at tobelikechrist.com. You can also buy a book on amazon.com that has all of the PDFs, all 50 of them printed off for you in color already, nicely laid out, and you don't have to burn through all the ink on your printer at home. But there's links to both of those things down in the description, both the book you can buy and the free PDFs. We want to know, first of all, when the events of Genesis 18 played out on our timeline. Well, this is picking up right at the end of 17. At the end of 17, you remember what Abraham was doing? He was doing that great act of faith, which was circumcising himself and his household as the sign of the covenant of the promises between him and God. Those promises being that God was going to make him into a great nation, God was going to give his descendants the land of Canaan, and God was going to bless the entire earth through his family. So as a sign of that, as a sign of his faith, God asked him to be circumcised. And that was going to be something that was going to persist in Abraham and then in Isaac's family forever as a sign of the covenant. That's what he's doing, and now we're picking up seemingly shortly after that in chapter 18. And you can kind of tell that not much time has passed, or that it's a continuation of the story from the way that the text of chapter 18 opens up. Keep in mind, the chapter breaks weren't in the original text. In the last chapter, we talked about how Abram was 99 years old when God spoke to him there, and guess what? He's still 99 years old in chapter 18. This is approximately 1897 BC, about 1900 years before Jesus is born. Our main characters, we've got, of course, Abraham and Sarah. Abram had his name changed to Abraham in the last chapter. Sarai had her name changed to Sarah in the last chapter, and that was because God was going to make them into the father and the mother of a great nation. But we also have two other key characters in this chapter, and the way that they're introduced in the text is kind of interesting. Their identity is only revealed as we go through the text. When they're first introduced, they're introduced as three men that show up at Abraham's tent. What we find out, though, is that one of them is actually the Lord, God. He visits Abraham and Sarah seemingly in the form of a man. And then the two other men who are with him are two angels that accompany the Lord to Abraham's tent. So those are our key figures. Now let's talk about where these events happened. We've got kind of two main locations here. Abram was living near the oaks of Mamre when the Lord visited him and Sarah. According to Genesis chapter 13, verse 18, the oaks of Mamre were in Hebron, which is to the west, maybe 15 miles of the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea. And again, in case you haven't heard me say this multiple times already, on the PDF that you can download on our website, there's a custom map to show these locations. So you might want to grab that for your reference whenever you have the chance and save those somewhere. Towards the end of the chapter, the focus shifts towards the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Oaks of Mamre, or Hebron, is the first key location. Towards the end of the chapter, the focus shifts towards the city of Sodom, this wicked city where Abraham's nephew Lot lived. Now, no one knows exactly where Sodom was. The reason for that is because we're going to find out there's not going to be a whole lot left of Sodom when God's done with it, but that's for a future study. Sodom, most historians hypothesize that Sodom was somewhere in the southern part of the Dead Sea, along the southern coast of the Dead Sea. So I've got on the map kind of just a highlight of the bottom half of the Dead Sea, and somewhere along the coast, a lot of people think it was on the southern side or maybe on the western side that Sodom was located. But again, nobody knows for sure. With its 33 verses, this chapter is a little bit longer than some of the others that we've looked at before. I have it broken down pretty evenly into two sections, verses 1 through 15 and then verses 16 through 33. The first 15 verses I've got titled as I keep now that I got used to saying Abram, I'm having trouble saying Abraham. Abraham hosts three heavenly guests. So the Lord and two men, who we will later discover were angels, we're going to find that out, and it's going to be reaffirmed in the next chapter. They visited Abraham at his tent near the Oaks of Mamre. Abraham invited his guests to rest under a tree and to take some time to refresh themselves from their journey. And he goes in and he tells Sarah to prepare some cakes. And Abraham goes and then he makes arrangements for a calf to be slaughtered and cooked. Can you imagine if you showed up somewhere and you wanted something to eat and you had to go out into the field and actually kill the cow yourself and then prepare it from scratch to be eaten? Not exactly fast food, but I'm sure they were a little quicker maybe than we would be today. As I already mentioned, when these three men are introduced in the chapter, they're just introduced that way as three men, but as the text progresses, we see that actually one of them is God himself. And the Lord and his angels, they eat the food, and then the Lord repeats his promise to Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a son. The same promise was received in Genesis chapter 17, but this time Sarah hears it directly from the mouth of the Lord. Sarah was not present with the men while they were eating, but she was actually in the tent. So she was at the door of the tent, and she laughed when she heard the promise, because the text says that she was first advanced in years. She's about 90 years old, and, quote, the way of women had ceased from her, which I think is a pretty clear way of saying that she is not going to biologically have a child. The natural processes that are required to do that are not taking place in her body any longer. She's aware of that, and so her response to hearing the promise of God is she laughs at it. Now, the Lord wasn't going to let her get away with this little snicker or laugh. We don't know if it's actually audible. It says that she laughed to herself, Is that just, in her head, in her thoughts, or was it just, very low volume? We're not exactly sure. Maybe there's some hint in the Hebrew that I'm not expert enough to know. But, right, this is a laugh that's not supposed to be heard by the men outside. And yet the Lord, he knows everything. And so the Lord asked Abraham why his wife laughed. And he said, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Sarah was afraid. I would be too. She's afraid that she's been caught in this moment of doubt and this lack of faith, and laughing at the Lord is not a thing you want to be doing. And so she follows this up by making another not wise move, and that is she lies to the Lord. She says, "I didn't laugh." And the Lord says to her, "Yep, you did." But that's the end of it. He doesn't strike her dead, or she doesn't get the Nadab and Abihu treatment or anything like that, which is good. Our story would be very different if that were the case, because, well, we wouldn't be following Abraham and Sarah's family for very long. But anyway, Nadab and Abihu are in Acts chapter 5, if you want to read about them. The Lord then just goes ahead, and rather than striking anybody dead or yelling at anybody, he just restates the promise, and he tells them that when he comes back in about a year, they are going to have a son. Thanks to the power of editing, I was able to pause my recording just after I made those statements and listen to them again. And I said, did I say Nadab and Abihu? I did not mean to say Nadab and Abihu. I meant to say Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira lie to the Lord in Acts chapter 5. And you don't want the fate that they received. I said Nadab and Abihu are there in Leviticus chapter 10. They have other problems, and you don't want the fate that they received either. But I did not mean to say Nadab and Abihu. I meant to say Ananias and Sapphira. And this mercy of not punishing Sarah for her lack of faith or not lashing out at her, the fact that she doesn't receive any kind of punishment for chuckling at God and then lying to him, is a great sign of his mercy and his grace. And we're going to come back to that in our application section. So this is the first part of chapter 18. We see a reaffirmation of the promise, and the Lord now gives us a timeline, which is something that certainly Abraham and Sarah had been maybe hoping for a long time, because God had made them this promise that they were going to become a great nation 24 years prior to this, way back in Haran, but he didn't tell them when it was going to happen. So now, finally, they know how long this is going to take, at least to get the ball rolling, at least till they have their first child, Isaac. It's going to be 1 year from now. So I'm sure this was a very special and encouraging moment for them once they got over their doubts. This now brings us to section number 2, which is verses 16 through 33, the title being, Abraham Negotiates with the Lord to Save Sodom. So having enjoyed Abraham's hospitality, talk about intimidating. The Lord comes to your house and you have to cook for him. The Lord and his 2 angels then leave Abram's tent and they depart towards the city of Sodom. Now the angels continue on their journey, but the Lord stops to speak with Abraham. And the Lord tells Abraham of his intentions. There's some debate. He's seemingly talking to the 2 angels that are with him, talking about, should we reveal what we are going to do to the city of Sodom and what our intentions are? And the Lord concludes, yes, we should, because Abraham needs to know about this, because it's going to be his responsibility to teach his descendants to act differently than Sodom has acted. He's supposed to teach this great nation that's growing out of him to live in righteousness and to live in godliness. And for that reason, he needs to know what happens to the wicked. He's going to need to know what happens to the city of Sodom. So God tells Abraham that he has come down to inspect the city and the wickedness and to see if it's really as bad as he has heard. Now, I find this to be really interesting language, because does the Lord actually need to come down from heaven to walk the streets of Sodom or to send people to inspect the city to know what's going on? No, of course not. He knows everything. What's interesting to me is that this is really similar language to what we saw in the story of the Tower of Babel, that the Lord comes down to inspect the city. And in both cases, these are wicked cities that are involved in work and in actions and in deeds that God is not pleased with, and he's going to do something about it. So God tells Abraham of his intentions to punish Sodom for their wickedness and for their immorality. I want to make a comment that kind of builds on a point that we made in a previous study, and that is that keep in mind, back in Genesis chapter 13, that was years before this. It's there that Sodom is described as an extremely wicked city, that the people there are great sinners against the Lord, and yet God allows Sodom to continue doing what they're doing for years. And so now God announces this potential judgment on the city of Sodom. And again, what we see is the patience and the long suffering of God, that he doesn't bring about these harsh judgments, just out of the blue, decide one day, I'm going to wipe those people off the face of the earth. No, here again, even in Sodom, we see a years-long patience with the wicked. But just as with the flood, there comes a time when too much evil is too much, and God will judge. We talked about that previously with the Amorites. You remember God said that he's not going to give the Israelites or Abraham's descendants the land of Canaan for another 400 years because the Amorites aren't yet wicked enough to receive their judgment. And so in their case, God has 400 years of patience with them. That's 4 centuries. That's incredible patience. Here again, we see even in Sodom, it takes the Lord years to come in and to act with the harsh judgment that he's going to bring about. That's a little bit of a spoiler, but I think that point is worth making here. So now let's talk about Abraham's negotiations for Sodom. Obviously, he's invested in Sodom a little bit because Lot is there. And I think we'd probably also see just Abraham's concern for righteous people, for God-fearing people here. So when God says that he's going to judge Sodom for their wickedness, the news is concerning to Abraham because he doesn't want the small number or the potential small number of righteous people in Sodom to die on account of their wicked neighbors. He asked the Lord to spare Sodom if he can find 50 righteous people inside. 50 is not too much, right? We don't know what the population of this city was, but Abraham seems like he thinks, at least at first, that this is reasonable. He says, if you can find 50 people there, will you spare the city? And God says, I will. Abraham then asked the Lord to spare the city if he could find 45. Abraham seems to be having some doubts. He's like, wow, what if there's 5 missing off that number? What if there's only 45? And the Lord says, I'll save it for 45. And then he asked the Lord again, and his answers or his responses back to the Lord are kind of funny. He says, don't be angry with me, don't be angry with me, but will you spare it for 40 righteous people? And the Lord agrees. And Abraham continues lowering that number until God agrees to spare Sodom if he can find 10 righteous people who live there. I mean, you've got to be able to find 10, right? 10 people who at least have a conscience. And Abraham seemingly knows that Lot is there. So Lot and maybe his family make up 3, 4, 5, 6 of those people. We only need a few here. So once Abraham gets the Lord down to 10 people, he seems to think, okay, that's safe. And after their conversation, their negotiation, the Lord leaves, he departs, and Abraham returns to his tent. And that's where the chapter ends. Now, why is this negotiation in here? It shows us a little bit about Abraham's character, but I think primarily, probably, it's in here to show us just how wicked the city of Sodom actually is. So I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. In future chapters, we're going to talk more about Sodom, its fate, and we're also going to find out the fate of Lot and his family who are living there. Are they going to make it out alive? Are they going to receive the judgment that befalls the city? All that for an upcoming study. So that's the outline that I have, our 2 sections for Genesis chapter 18. Now, I had mentioned that we're going to return to the mercy and the grace that God shows to Sarah even after she laughs at him and she lies to him. I was thinking about this in terms of a lot of earthly rulers or people on earth that have power. Aren't you thankful that we have a God who is patient enough to be laughed at? I certainly would not encourage you to laugh at God, but there are times when we all do stupid things that we shouldn't do that relate to our relationship to the Lord, and God has had patience on us in the past, keeping us alive, not enacting some kind of severe and immediate judgment on us. But that's different from a lot of other men who have, even a fraction of the authority that God has. Most men in positions of authority don't tolerate their inferiors laughing at them. They're quick to reprimand or to demote somebody or imprison them or sometimes kill people who laugh at them. You've probably heard about these kings, from history who someone will do some slight thing against them. They'll cause some slight offense to their name, and they have them killed. You watch these movies where kings just have people killed for willy-nilly kind of whatever they want because they're the king. They can do that, and no one's allowed to have a laugh at their expense. But God, who is the most powerful being in existence, was still willing to bless Sarah after she laughed at his words. I suppose this is a good example of what Jesus, God, preaches in the Gospels. If somebody curses you, bless them. Sarah laughs at God and then lies to him. And he says, well, I'm still going to bless you. This also reiterates a point that we made in our last study, and that is why does God choose Abraham and Sarah to be his special people and for God's special nation of Israel to grow out of? Is it because they're just so special, so perfect, so righteous, so faultless? Nope. It's because God has this tremendous grace on them and gives them this blessing, often in spite of themselves. And we certainly see that here with Sarah. So God treats Sarah well even after she treats him poorly. And he has to remind her, is anything too hard for the Lord? Of course, the answer to that was no, and hopefully that stuck with her and Abraham in the future. But here's the application, just something to appreciate. Praise God for being exceedingly patient while being exceedingly powerful. That's a very rare, if at all, existent trait in human beings, right? But God has that in spades. He's exceedingly patient while at the same time being exceedingly powerful. That is our study for Genesis chapter 18. I hope you were able to get something out of it. I will ask once again, if you're using one of the podcast players that has a rating system, if you would leave us a rating, a star rating, that would be really appreciated. I just want to thank everybody who's been tuning in, leaving good comments. There's been people also watching on the YouTube channel. And if you have any comments that you'd like to leave down in the comment section, please feel free to do that if anything needs to be clarified or if I messed up anything like my Nadab and Abihu, Ananias and Sapphira thing that I didn't end up catching. Feel free to correct it down in the bottom. I'm sure this will not be the last time. Thanks everybody for listening. Lord willing, I will see you again soon. We'll talk about Genesis 19.